Hello dear friends, and welcome to my channel. Buckle up folks, because today we're diving into a topic that's equal parts fascinating, horrifying, and surprisingly smelly: hygiene at the Palace of Versailles in the 17th century. Yep, we're talking about how the royals kept things clean, or didn't. Spoiler alert, it's not as glamorous as it looks in period dramas. Now, when you hear Palace of Versailles, your brain probably conjures up a picture straight out of a fairy tale. Elegant women gliding around in extravagant, hand-embroidered dresses so wide they could double as a portable tent. And don't forget those powdered wigs, because nothing says, "I'm rich," like hair that looks like it was dunked in flour and topped with a garden party. And the men, they weren't slacking either. Picture them in the most over-the-top outfits, strutting around with lace cuffs, velvet breeches, and a confidence level only achievable when you're wearing heels higher than your wife's. Champagne was flowing, people were waltzing through grand ballrooms, and somewhere in the background, a poor servant was juggling a tray of desserts while mentally questioning their life choices. All that glam was just the surface. Beneath the wigs and silk, there was a not-so-glamorous reality, a crusty, funky underbelly that makes you grateful for your modern shower. This was the age of Louis XIV, Sun King, who was all about living large and making bold statements, like, "The state is me." Talk about confidence. It was Louis XIV who turned Versailles from a relatively normal hunting lodge into the epitome of luxury. And by luxury, I mean it took over 20 years and an ungodly amount of taxpayer money to build. Think of it like the world's longest and most expensive home renovation project. Imagine this. It's 1685, and we're time traveling to attend one of Louis XIV's famous balls. Sounds like a dream, right? The music, the dancing, the outfits. But here's the million-dollar question. How would that ball smell? Probably not great. Louis XIV himself often insisted on flinging open the windows and doors during these events, which makes you wonder, was it for the ambience, or was it his royal way of saying, "Dear God, let some air in here before I pass out"? But the real fun begins when you ask yourself, how did these fabulously dressed people actually bathe? And where? Because, and brace yourself for this one, the entire Palace of Versailles, with its 700 jaw-droppingly opulent rooms, had exactly one full-fledged bathroom. Yes, one. 700 rooms, endless mirrors, mountains of gold leaf, and one bathroom. Oh, and this wasn't just any bathroom. This thing cost more than 5 country estates. And yet, despite all that bling, it was reserved exclusively for the king and his favorite mistress, Madame de Montespan. And here's the kicker, they didn't even use it to wash. That's right. We'll get into the whole not actually bathing thing in a bit, so hang tight for that delightful nugget of history. Now, while we're here, ever notice how there isn't a single portrait of Louis XIV smiling? Coincidence? I think not. Between the questionable hygiene and the perpetual funk wafting through the palace halls, the man probably didn't have a lot to grin about, or maybe really bad teeth. So, how did the glamorous inhabitants of Versailles in the 17th century manage to stay clean? And by clean, I mean a standard that will make you eternally grateful for modern plumbing and deodorant. And let's not even get into the purity of their thoughts. It wasn't their strongest suit. Alright, let's address the rumors and truly horrifying truths about Versailles. First up, is it true that you could take a royal leak under a beautifully manicured bush, under the stairs, or even, brace yourself, on the throne? Yes, welcome to Versailles. And what about the smell? Yep, it's true. This place, with all its gold and grandeur, reeked like a medieval garbage dump. Slop was literally chucked out of windows by people who were otherwise considered the intellectual elite of their time. Let's rewind to the very foundations of Versailles, literally. This palace was built on a swamp. Yes, a swamp. Because apparently, nothing says royal luxury like a soggy, mosquito-infested piece of land. Fun fact: swamps were the trendy real estate choice back in the late 17th and early 18th centuries for building cities and palaces. Who knew? Of course, this meant Versailles had its fair share of issues with fresh drinking water, because, you know, swamps. Even after they managed to sort out the water supply, it didn't inspire people to suddenly start, you know, bathing. Why? Because the 17th century had an absolutely wild take on cleanliness. Let's talk about the star of our show, Louis XIV. The Sun King himself. There are rumors that the man bathed only once in his life, when he was born. But hold on, according to some sources, that's not entirely accurate. They say Louis actually bathed 3 whole times. But wait, before you start judging him too harshly, let's put things into perspective. Louis considered himself an exceptionally clean guy. Yep, you heard that right, clean. In his defense, he was a passionate, very busy man. The guy had a revolving door of mistresses, and according to some biographers, he needed to, let's say, release some energy several times a day. Now, how could he manage all that action with 3 layers of grime on him? So, during the reign of Louis XIV, they weren't exactly hopping into bubble baths with rubber duckies. Instead, they embraced the art of the dry bath. What's a dry bath? It's basically wiping yourself down with perfumed wet napkins soaked in an alkaline solution. Yes, Louis XIV and his closest crew were out here pioneering the wet wipe life, centuries before it hit grocery store shelves. Imagine grabbing a pack of wipes for your hands, then casually going, you know what? Let's just hit the armpits while we're at it. Relatable. But why on earth was this the go-to hygiene routine? Well, let's dive into 17th century science, or what passed for it back then. The French at the time were absolutely terrified of water. Yes, terrified. They believed that taking a bath opened your pores, which, in their minds, was basically an open invitation for all the plagues, pestilence, and bad vibes to waltz right into your body. At the same time, all the good stuff, whatever that was, would just leak out. I mean, who needed soap when your pores were apparently trying to sabotage you? So, the logic was simple. Don't bathe. Ever. And honestly, if you saw the state of the water back then, you'd probably agree. Picture this. You step into a pond feeling fine and dandy, and step out looking like you just went 5 rounds with scabies. Despite his allegiance to the sacred wet napkin, Louis XIV wasn't completely against a little dip now and then. On hot summer days, he'd indulge in a quick swim in a nearby pond, where they'd set up a royal chamber for his convenience because, of course, the king didn't just cannonball into the water like the rest of us peasants. And, believe it or not, Louis even took baths on doctor's orders. Yep, the Sun King was a bit of a health nut. He was so committed to staying healthy that he had his doctor keep a health diary for him. These baths weren't for hygiene. They were prescribed for joint pain and lung inflammation. Essentially, Louis wasn't bathing to get clean, he was bathing to survive. Let's talk about the royal bathing routine, a phrase that might be overselling it just a tad. When Louis XIV decided it was time for a rare splash, it involved 2 bowls, one for washing and the other for rinsing. Simple enough, but let's be real, this wasn't happening on a weekly, or even monthly, basis. So no, the rumor that Louis only washed 3 times in his life is a bit of a stretch. He definitely upped that number, though not by much. Louis took things up a notch when it came to showing off. He had a custom bathing room constructed, featuring a gigantic marble bowl carved from a single block of marble, because why not? This wasn't just any old marble, it was Versailles-level fancy. The whole setup cost more than a mansion on the outskirts of Paris, which is saying something. And who was it for? Louis and one of his top-tier mistresses, Madame de Montespan. If you're picturing Louis and Montespan having luxurious, bubbly baths together, scrubbing each other's backs, and singing duets, let's pump the brakes. That massive marble bowl wasn't built for bathing, it was built for entertainment. Yep, it was the center stage for their erotic games. The marble room wasn't about hygiene, it was about having a good time. Honestly, it's giving ancient sauna vibes, where the line between relaxation and debauchery has always been blurry. And while we're on the subject of saunas, Louis XIV wasn't above using them either. Sure, they sometimes doubled as spaces for work meetings, but let's not kid ourselves, most of the work was just men gossiping about their mistresses. Turns out, some things never change. However, as Louis got older, his relationship with water grew complicated. Like many in his circle, he developed an increasing fear of it. The belief that water was a one-way ticket to disease became deeply ingrained, and so the Sun King slowly phased out his dips in reservoirs, saunas, and even those fancy marble bowls. By the end, he was fully committed to his trusty wet napkins, staying true to the less water, more perfume philosophy of his time. In the 17th century, being considered clean at the Palace of Versailles was an entirely different concept from what we're used to today. Cleanliness didn't mean spotless skin or scrubbing away dirt, it was all about appearances. If your face looked clean, your clothes were fresh, your breath wasn't unbearable, and you smelled of pleasant fragrances like nutmeg or lavender, you were good to go. Both men and women poured perfume over themselves to mask the smell of sweat, using it as a substitute for proper hygiene. The Sun King, however, grew tired of the suffocating waves of scent as he got older. By the time he was 40, he found the overwhelming use of fragrances unbearable. Whenever he attended a ball or traveled in a carriage surrounded by women drenched in perfume, he would demand that windows and doors be opened to let in some fresh air. Clothing was a big part of maintaining this outward image of cleanliness. For the French aristocracy, shirts were changed frequently, sometimes as many as 5 or 6 times a day, especially after dancing at a ball. If a shirt began to smell, it was swapped for a fresh one immediately. Washing shirts was relatively simple, but dresses were a different matter. Since dresses were expensive, intricately sewn, and embroidered by hand, they were rarely, if ever, washed. Instead, stains were scrubbed off with brushes, and any visible dirt was removed. The rest of the dress stayed as it was because soaking such delicate garments in water and soap was out of the question. And as for what went on under those clothes, well, not many people cared. When it came to faces, the idea of cleanliness was also a far cry from modern standards. Louis XIV adored the theatre and often performed in plays himself, always choosing the most heroic and glamorous roles. The theatrical makeup he wore on stage naturally became fashionable at court. Aristocrats would apply heavy makeup to achieve a pale complexion, which was considered a sign of nobility. Bright red cheeks, often drawn on with beetroot dye, completed the look. To achieve this desired paleness, Louis XIV and his courtiers used Venetian lead whitewash, a popular cosmetic of the time. Unfortunately, lead wasn't exactly a friendly ingredient. It caused headaches, skin problems, and even hair loss. But none of that stopped people from using it, as appearances always took precedence over health. Before you even think about whipping up your own batch of lead-based whitewash at home, let's get one thing straight: don't do it. Lead is not your friend. Sure, it can give you that ghostly aristocratic glow, but it'll also age your skin faster than a month of sleepless nights, leaving you with wrinkles that scream, "I've lived through 300 years of questionable skincare choices." And that's just the beginning. Prolonged use of lead can bring on all sorts of party tricks: dizziness, nosebleeds, hallucinations, mental confusion, and even central nervous system meltdowns. To hide those inevitable skin disasters caused by not washing, everyone, from the king to your average powdered courtier, started drawing little black dots, or flies, on their faces. These weren't just regular dots. Some were so oversized they looked like hornet landing zones. Why did they do this? Well, the imperfections they were covering ranged from good old acne, because, surprise, not bathing and slathering lead on your skin causes breakouts, to smallpox scars and other delightful blemishes, courtesy of questionable hygiene practices. And then, we arrive at wigs, those towering monuments of 17th century fashion that deserve their own Netflix documentary. Wigs were the must-have accessory of the era. Why? Because appearing in public with a shiny bald head was just as socially acceptable as wearing socks with sandals. Baldness, whether from age or, brace yourself, sexually transmitted infections, was a major no-no. Yes, syphilis was such a fashion influencer that it made wigs the accessory of the century. Wigs were just made from human hair, and of course, that made him prime real estate for lice and fleas. But hey, better bugs in your wig than crawling on your scalp. If your wig started hosting a flea colony, you could just take it off, shake it out, hand it to your wig maker for cleaning, and voila, ready for the next ball. Just don't forget to collect new lice while you're there. However, wigs weren't exactly the pinnacle of comfort. They weighed a ton, made your head itch like crazy, and caused headaches and neck pain so severe that fainting was practically part of the dress code. It was all worth it, because nothing says nobility quite like passing out mid-conversation while scratching your powdered wig. Here we go again, diving into yet another glamorous chapter of 17th century hygiene. Let's talk about how people tackled the charming issue of bad breath and dental disasters back in the day. So, here's the tea. They didn't brush their teeth at all, but, to give them some credit, they did have some early attempts at dental care. Louis XIV, always one to lead the charge in weird trends, used a mix of astringent, sweet-tasting plants like licorice, rosewood, and rosemary. Basically, the medieval version of a breath mint. These were likely chewed or rubbed on the teeth. Sure, it wasn't oral B-level hygiene, but it's better than gnawing on a stick of goat hair. For the brave souls who dared to dream of toothbrushes, they were crafted from the roots and bark of plants. Innovative, yes. Effective, not so much. If you had a toothache, your options were limited. Best case, chew thyme for its pain-relieving properties. Worst case, get your tooth yanked out, and maybe a chunk of your face along with it. Case in point, Louis XIV once had so many teeth removed, healthy ones included, that a piece of his palate went missing. The result? Liquid food dripping out of his nostrils. If that sounds grim, wait until you hear about their attempts to whiten teeth. While some people rubbed their chompers with salt, charcoal, or pumice, imagine your teeth after that exfoliation session. The truly dedicated went full-on bonkers. Enter urine whitening. That's right. Some folks believed human urine was the secret to pearly whites. Probably, they had white teeth, but at what cost? Hygiene and dignity clearly packed their bags and left the building. For the wealthy, coral and ground-up stones were the tools of choice for polishing teeth. Of course, these materials obliterated enamel, which led to even worse teeth. And let's not forget tobacco chewing. Because who doesn't want to top off their decaying enamel with some fragrant, antibacterial, tobacco? Naturally, by the age of 30 or 40, if you were lucky to live that long, most aristocrats were flashing more gums than teeth. Some had already said goodbye to half their dental lineup, and others were sporting smiles that could clear a room faster than bad cologne. As I sit here with a full set of teeth, I can't help but be thankful for modern dentistry. Without it, I might be whispering this story to you like a toothless courtier, carefully shielding my gummy grin. But enough about teeth. Let's move on to an even juicier topic: toilets. Or, more accurately, the fascinatingly chaotic ways the French aristocracy handled their business. So, Versailles, this grand palace with hundreds of rooms and thousands of residents. It seems there was a bit of a problem when it came to toilets. Louis XIV, in all his splendor, had a palace with 700 rooms and only 2, maybe a handful, of actual toilets. Can you imagine? You'd think a king could manage a few more facilities, but nope. And with thousands of people coming and going, you'd expect some creative solutions. Let's talk about where everyone went to the toilet. Some of the more desperate souls might have ventured under the luxurious orange trees in the gardens of Versailles. Yes, really, under the trees. But as you can imagine, that kind of thing wasn't exactly accepted as a frequent practice. After all, Louis XIV wanted Versailles to be the most monumental, beautiful, expensive palace of his time. And when your palace starts stinking, it's a serious problem. Imagine the complaints from the aristocracy, all sweaty from their fancy gowns and wigs, suddenly realizing the garden wasn't smelling quite as lovely as it should. So Louis decided it was time for a little cleanup. He ordered weekly tidying sessions in the gardens, setting down a simple rule: if you make a mess, clean it up. Of course, no plastic bags in sight. People had to make do with dustpans and spatulas. For those who didn't want to brave the great outdoors and risk being spotted relieving themselves behind a bush, there was always the option to sneak into someone else's private space. Versailles wasn't without its servants, and apparently, bribing them was the key to accessing the good toilets. Imagine paying someone just so you could use the royal loo. Hey, can I borrow your potty for a minute? Definitely not a sentence you hear often at modern parties. And if you were really fancy, you might have had your own private chamber pot, made of fine ceramic or porcelain. But the true elite didn't just settle for a basic chamber pot. They had dresses, ornate, beautiful boxes with a hole in the middle for you to do your business in style. Imagine sitting on a finely crafted wooden seat, doing your royal duties, then having a servant come in immediately afterward to empty the pot. You'd go right back to your fancy dinner or mazurka, no big deal. But here's where it gets a little more comical. There's a story that's too perfect to ignore. Whether it's true or not is another matter, but it's too funny to pass up. This one happened not to Louis XIV, but to his successor, Louis XVI. The king, wanting to take care of some business, sat down on his beautiful dresser and, well, let's just say, he didn't get the pleasant experience he was hoping for. Instead of the fine, porcelain seat he expected, he was met with a few savage scratches. Turns out, an Angora cat had decided to take a nap inside the pot. Can you imagine? 1 minute, the king is all dignified, ready to relieve himself in royal style, and the next, he's jumping up in a panic, possibly with a royal yelp in the process. In the end, even the grandest of palaces couldn't escape the basic human need to pee. Versailles may have been a palace of unimaginable luxury, but when it came to toilets, it was basically a hot mess. No one blamed the cat for scratching the king's royal posterior. I mean, it was just a misunderstanding. After all, who would expect a cat to claim such a spot in the most royal of places? But no one was sent to the gallows over it, luckily for the feline. As for Louis XVI, well, he surely learned a valuable lesson. When the chamber pots were full, people didn't just run off to the bathroom to empty them, like we would do today. Sometimes, the contents of these pots were simply poured out through the windows of the palace. Fortunately, this didn't happen very often, and eventually, a decree was passed to stop the practice. I suppose that's a good thing. Imagine walking under the windows of Versailles, minding your own business, and then whoosh, you're suddenly covered in, well, you know. There's even a rumor that once, during the time of Marie Antoinette, who was around in the late 18th century, not long after Louis XVI, she and her sister were walking by the windows of the palace when they almost became the target of a rogue chamber pot. As for the more official way of handling the mess, there were special cesspools dug throughout Versailles to collect all the waste. But, naturally, some of the servants, being a bit lazy, just couldn't be bothered to carry the pots all the way to the cesspools. Instead, they simply took the easy route and tossed it out of the window. Not ideal, really, but I guess everyone has their shortcuts. And speaking of shortcuts, let's not forget the question of what people used to wipe themselves with. Toilet paper, something we all take for granted today. But back in the 18th century, that was not yet a thing. It wasn't until the middle of the 19th century that it really started making its way into certain circles of society. Marie Antoinette, who, as we know, was very much part of the elite, used embroidered cotton handkerchiefs. But these weren't just any old handkerchiefs, mind you. These were pristine, white, freshly embroidered with colorful threads, probably crafted by skilled hands. Can you imagine embroidering a beautiful handkerchief with delicate designs, only to later, well, use it for less than dignified purposes? Personally, if I had spent hours sewing a gorgeous, embroidered handkerchief, the last thing I'd want is for it to be used in such a way. It's a bit of a tough one, isn't it? Versailles, of course, wasn't just any palace. It was an immense, monumental symbol of the Sun King's glory. But like any massive estate, there were certain realities, and one of those was the question of where to relieve oneself. Some, let's say, toilets, but in fact just pots, were set around the palace, usually tucked away in distant corners or hidden behind staircases and doors in far-off wings. Most of the time, they were simply chairs with pots placed underneath, nothing like the neat, private toilet cubicles we're accustomed to. And for those too pressed for time or lost in the labyrinthine corridors of Versailles, well, the toilet could end up being just about anywhere they happened to be caught short. Can you imagine the frustration? You've just eaten some stale oysters, and suddenly, your stomach makes its demands. Worse still, if you weren't familiar with the layout of the palace, it wasn't always easy to find the nearest toilet. Men had it somewhat easier, of course, thanks to their more convenient physiology. But women, that was a different story. With skirts that went on forever, navigating the palace with any sense of urgency was nearly impossible. Here's where it gets really interesting. In order to deal with the challenge of being caught in a delicate situation while wandering the halls of Versailles, women had a portable solution, a small pot, often strapped under their skirts. These were known as borderless. And yes, these quirky little contraptions have an even more curious backstory. They were named after a preacher, Louis Bordelou, who was infamous for delivering sermons that seemed to stretch on forever. It seems that while he was droning on, some enterprising women found a way to multitask, listening to the sermon and, well, relieving themselves. Of course, the ideal solution was always to dispose of the contents in the designated cesspools, but even those came with their own problems. The cesspools of Versailles were not cleaned regularly, a small oversight when you have thousands of people living under one roof. If your window happened to overlook one of these cesspools, you weren't likely to wake up to the fresh, floral scents of Versailles gardens. Instead, you'd be greeted by the foul stench of human waste. Not exactly the aromatic welcome one hopes for while living in a palace, I'd imagine. And as if that wasn't bad enough, the overflow from these cesspools sometimes made its way into nearby reservoirs, which were used for, well, not drinking, thankfully, but for washing clothes and linens. Can you picture it? Washing your sheets in water that had been contaminated by raw sewage. A royal disaster in every sense of the word. It's hard to imagine a place as grand and opulent as Versailles dealing with such unsavory issues, but it was an unfortunate reality of life in the 17th and 18th centuries. A grand palace, yes, but not always the most hygienic or pleasant place to be. Still, these quirky details give us a fascinating peek into the less glamorous aspects of history, where even royalty had to contend with the basic necessities of life, just like the rest of us. And we know for certain that some of its residents weren't exactly thrilled with the smell of their sheets, duvet covers, and pillowcases. Alpine freshness was not the scent of the day, unfortunately. But the most tragic chapter came after the death of Louis XIV. With his passing, many of the residents began to abandon the palace, and the neglect of the cesspools grew more and more evident. Over time, this neglect led to the pollution of a nearby pond, which, unfortunately, was used by the locals for both fishing and as a source of drinking water. As you might expect, this eventually resulted in an outbreak of intestinal infections, cholera, to be specific. And, tragically, people died from it. This was a dark period for Versailles. The once grand palace began to fall into disrepair, and its previous grandeur seemed a distant memory. However, both Louis XV and Louis XVI later returned to the palace, and despite its troubled past, Versailles eventually became the iconic historical landmark we know today, one of the most famous tourist attractions in the world. And now, after all this history, we've learned a little bit more about how people lived in the palace. From the beauty and grandeur to the unspoken realities of daily life, it's a fascinating glimpse into an era that was far from perfect. Thank you so much for sticking with me through this story. I hope you enjoyed this little history lesson. If you liked it, feel free to give it a like. And if not, feel free to dislike it. Either way, I'd really appreciate your thoughts in the comments below, as it helps support the channel. Thanks again.